The first sound is not a voice but a breath, a slow, deliberate exhalation that seems to fog the inside of a glass case. Let your eyes adjust to the darkness. You are standing in a library that no longer exists, the oldest store library on Lafayette Street, long since dissolved into the city's marrow. But in the hush of this archive, time is a suggestion, not a rule. Look closer at the vitrine. There, resting on faded velvet the color of dried blood, lies a manuscript. It is not typed, it is not printed. It is a cascade of ink, sloping violently across the page as though the hand that held the pen were fighting a sudden swell of the floor. The title, scratched out and written again, reads, MS, Found in a Bottle. You know the story, you think you do. A man adrift, a ghost ship, a voyage to the pole. The tale that launched a career from the depths of a penny-a-page magazine. But what if the manuscript we read was not the first draft? What if the one we have enshrined in anthologies is merely the survivor, the polite version, while the true, unfinished voyage lies elsewhere, hidden in the margins of Poe's brief, tormented life? We are not here to tell you what happened to Edgar Allan Poe. That mystery belongs to the ages, and to the cobblestones of Baltimore, where he was found wearing another man's clothes, muttering words no one could quite catch. No, we are here to follow a darker thread, a thread that begins not with his death, but with his obsession. In 1833, before the Raven, before the Telltale Heart, before the fame that would not save him, Poe submitted a story to a contest. It was rejected, but the story, that first, lost version of the bottle manuscript, was not destroyed. According to a single, contested entry in the diary of a Baltimore editor, Poe retrieved the pages, folded them into his coat, and was heard to say, "It is not finished. It will never be finished. It must be found." Found by whom, and by what? In the quiet hours before dawn, when the gaslights gutter and the ink in the well seems to breathe, we invite you to turn the page, to leave the safety of the known shore, to follow the trail of ink that leads not to a resolution, but to a revelation. Keep the candle lit. In the autumn of 1833, Baltimore was a city of brick and ambition, its cobblestones still wet with the residue of a nation still finding its footing. It was in a cramped boarding house on Amity Street that a 24-year-old Edgar Allan Poe sat by a single candle, his fingers stained with ink, his coat patched at the elbows. He had come to Baltimore to live with his aunt, Maria Clem, and her daughter, Virginia, a household that would come to define the twin poles of his existence, desperate poverty and profound devotion. The Baltimore Saturday Visitor had announced a contest, $50 for the best tale, $50 for the best poem. To a man who had recently been discharged from West Point and was living on the edge of destitution, $50 was not a prize, it was a lifeline. Poe submitted 6 stories. They were the work of a mind already attuned to the grotesque, the arabesque, the corners of consciousness where reason falters. The judges, John Pendleton Kennedy, John H.B. Lathrop, and James H. Miller, read them in a parlor lit by whale oil lamps, the flame guttering against the weight of the prose. They agreed on one thing immediate. The most striking submission was a tale of the sea. A man adrift on a derelict ship, swept toward the South Pole, writing his final testament as the world contracts into a cataract of ice and shadow. They awarded him the first prize for fiction. But here the record fractures. The story we know today as MS, Found in a Bottle, is a masterpiece of compression. It is 4,000 words of existential dread, concluding with the narrator's final, incomplete sentence as the ship plunges into the whirlpool. It is polished. It is perfect. It is, in its way, a surrender to the form of the magazine tale. But the version the judges first read was different. John Pendleton Kennedy, a novelist and philanthropist who would become Poe's first great patron, wrote a letter to a colleague that would later be discovered in a private collection, sold at auction in 1921, and then lost again. In that letter, Kennedy described the original bottle manuscript as a thing of fever. He wrote, "The tale is not a tale, it is a log. The narrator does not die, he keeps writing. The pages continue past what any printer would dare set. He writes of the water entering the cabin. He writes of the ink diluting. He writes of the last page floating. And still, the hand continues." The judges, according to Kennedy, were unsettled. They appreciated the power of it, but they were practical men. They knew what the public would read. They knew what would sell. They returned the manuscript to Poe with a request: shorten it, give it an end, let the ship sink, and let the reader close the magazine with a shiver, not a lingering dread that follows them to bed. Poe agreed. He needed the money, he needed the recognition. But he did not destroy the original. There is a moment in the life of every writer when the thing they write for publication diverges from the thing they write for themselves. The first is commerce. The second is compulsion. Poe kept the first draft. We know this because years later, in 1840, when he was preparing the 2-volume collection Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, he wrote to a publisher about including the bottle story. He referred to it in a way that suggests he still possessed a version that was not the one the public knew. He called it the original Voyage, the one that does not conclude. What happened to that manuscript? We can trace its ghost through a series of disappearances. In 1842, Poe lent a bundle of papers to a friend in Philadelphia, a journalist named Frederick W. Thomas. Thomas later wrote that he returned them, but Poe's correspondence from that period contains a note of panic. The sea papers, have you them? I cannot find the sea papers. The sea papers, not the story, the sea papers. We must pause here to allow the weight of that phrase to settle. A writer does not call a finished tale papers. A writer calls a work in progress, a living document, a thing that is still breathing, papers. Poe was not looking for a manuscript he had already published. He was looking for the version that continued past the whirlpool. He never found them, or if he did, he never mentioned them again. But the bottle would return. In the margins of his later works, in the obsessive nautical imagery of the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, in the letters written in the final years when his handwriting began to slant like the deck of a listing ship, we sense that the original Voyage was not abandoned. It was merely waiting. Let us consider the object itself, a bottle, a vessel designed to contain, to preserve, to send across the void. In Poe's hands, the bottle is not merely a plot device. It is a symbol of the artist's predicament, to seal one's truth in glass, to cork it, to cast it into the waters of public opinion, hoping it washes ashore somewhere safe, somewhere where it will be understood. But what if the bottle was not the container? What if it was the thing being contained? The manuscript found in a bottle, not the bottle found containing a manuscript. The language of the title performs a quiet inversion. The bottle is the primary object. The manuscript is secondary, discovered inside it. Poe, the master of the unreliable container, understood that the vessel shapes the message. The bottle is the world's pressure. The manuscript is the voice compressed within it. In the original, unpublished version, the bottle does not survive. The narrator describes it breaking against the ice, the pages scattering across the water, each one a separate, floating fragment of consciousness. The story does not end because the story is no longer a story. It has become the sea. This is what the judges could not publish. This is what Poe could not let go. And so we begin our voyage not with the tale that won the prize, but with the tale that was never allowed to end. A tale that exists now only in the space between what Poe wrote and what he was permitted to say. Keep the candle lit. The water is rising. Before there was a manuscript, there was a sound, the creak of mooring ropes, the slap of brackish water against wooden hulls, the smell of tar and salt in distant, unnamed places. Edgar Poe was not born to the sea. He was born to the theater. His parents, David and Elizabeth Poe, were actors, their lives a nomadic caravan of costumes and painted backdrops. But by the time he was 3, both were dead. He was taken in by John Allan, a Richmond tobacco merchant whose wealth was built on the trade routes that connected Virginia to Liverpool and the Caribbean. And so in the Allan household, the sea was not a romantic abstraction. It was commerce. It was the artery of empire. But to a boy with a volatile foster father and a longing for escape, the docks were something else. They were the edge of the known world. Richmond in the 1810s was a port city. Ships laden with tobacco left the James River, sailed past the capes of Virginia, and vanished into the Atlantic. Young Edgar would wander the wharves, listening to the sailors who gathered in the taverns along Carey Street. They told stories that no book would print, of waters so calm they became mirrors, reflecting a sky that was not quite the sky, of sounds beneath the keel, like bells ringing in deep cathedrals, of ships that sailed into a fog and emerged with no crew, the cabin still warm, the coffee still in the cups. One story told to him by an old sea captain named William Gwyn would lodge itself in his memory like a splinter. Gwyn spoke of the Aurora, a whaler out of Nantucket that had set sail in 1807 for the South Pacific. It was never seen again, but 3 years later a bottle was found floating off the coast of Chile. Inside was a single scrap of paper, the ink faded to a brown stain. On it, one word, drift. No context, no signature, just the word. Poe would retell this story in various forms throughout his life. He told it to his classmates at the University of Virginia, to his fellow cadets at West Point, to the editors who asked him where his imagination found its darker currents. He always emphasized the same detail. The bottle was sealed with black wax, and the word was written in a hand so steady it seemed to have been written in a calm, as though the ship had not been sinking but resting. At 17, Poe attempted to run away to sea. He had quarreled with John Allan, as he often did, and the prospect of a clerk's life in the Allan warehouse filled him with a nausea he would later describe in his stories as the imp of the perverse, the inexplicable urge to undo oneself. He made it as far as Norfolk before Allan's agents caught him. He was brought back, humiliated, and packed off to the University of Virginia, where he would accumulate gambling debts that severed the final ties with his foster father. But the sea never released him. In his fiction, the ocean is not a place of adventure. It is a place of dissolution. In MS, found in a bottle, the narrator does not fight the current. He surrenders to it. In the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, the journey to the Antarctic ends in a vision of a white figure, a threshold that cannot be crossed. In A Descent into the Maelstrom, the fisherman escapes the whirlpool not by resisting it, but by understanding its physics, by becoming, for a moment, part of its logic. These are not stories of sailors. They are stories of a man who stood at the edge of the water and felt the pull of a world that does not obey the laws of return. We must consider for a moment the possibility that Poe's maritime obsession was not merely literary. In 1844, the year he moved to New York, he attempted to purchase a small sailboat. The boat was a sloop called the Emma, docked in Battery Park. He had no sailing experience. His health was fragile. His wife was dying of tuberculosis, yet he spent 3 weeks negotiating for the vessel, writing letters to a broker, calculating the cost of provisions for a journey to Southampton. His friends intervened. They staged what can only be described as an intervention, convincing him that the voyage was madness. Poe relented. The Emma was sold to another buyer. But the question lingers. Was this a literary man's fantasy, or was it something else? Was Poe planning to follow the path of his narrators, to cast himself into the current, to become the manuscript in the bottle? We do not know, we cannot know, but we can mark the coordinates. The Emma was sold on April 15, 1844. 3 days later, Poe published The Balloon Hoax in the New York Sun, a fake news story about a transatlantic balloon crossing. It was a triumph of fabrication, a story so convincing it was believed for days. The man who could not sail built worlds where flight was possible. The man who longed for the sea wrote of it as a place of vanishing. The bottle that contained the word drift had found its author. Keep the candle lit. The tide is turning. Let the date settle in the mind like a stone dropped into deep water. 1844. It was the year Poe published The Purloined Letter, the third of his Dupin stories, a masterpiece of ratiocination. It was the year he moved his family to New York, to a small house on Greenwich Street, where Virginia's cough grew worse with each passing month. It was the year he tried to buy a boat. The philosopher of composition, the man who famously wrote that every element of a story should be calculated, every effect planned, every word weighed for its contribution to a single, unified impression. This was the Poe who lectured on the poetic principle, who dissected The Raven, in a lecture so clinical it seemed to leave no room for mystery. But the man who tried to buy a boat was not the philosopher. He was the one who wrote, in a letter to a friend, "I am not certain that I am here." The letters from 1844 are the most revealing documents in the Poe archive. They exist in a strange twilight between genius and dissolution. In one, he describes a new story he is planning. A man builds a boat out of the pages of his own books and sails into a storm. The storm shreds the pages, and as each word is torn away, he forgets his life. The story was never written, but the image, the boat made of words dissolving into the sea, is the image of Poe himself in that year. Let us reconstruct the attempt to purchase the Emma. The records are sparse, but they exist. A broker named J.W.D. wrote to a client, "Mr. Poe, the author, has expressed interest in the sloop. He has no references for seamanship. I advised against the sale." Poe's own letter to a friend, Thomas Holly Chivers, is more candid. "I have found a vessel. She is small but sound. I will take Virginia to the sea. The doctors say the salt air will help her lungs. I say the sea will help my mind." It is a heartbreaking document. The rationalization, the salt air for Virginia's health, is the kind of justification a man makes when he cannot admit what he truly wants. What did Poe truly want? To sail to Southampton, as he claimed, to follow the trajectory of his narrators into the whirlpool, or simply to be on the water to feel the deck move beneath him, to exchange the solidity of land for the uncertainty of the current? We cannot say, but we know that Chivers, who had his own tendencies toward the dramatic, wrote back urging caution. "You are not a sailor," he wrote. "You are a poet. The sea will not read your verses. It will take you." The Emma was sold to a merchant from New Haven on April 22. Poe never owned a boat. There is a theory among Poe's scholars, a quiet theory, whispered in footnotes, that the famous essay, The Philosophy of Composition, was not a description of how Poe wrote The Raven, but a performance, a mask, a way of imposing order on a process that was, in reality, chaotic, compulsive, and driven by forces he could not name. In 1844, the same year he tried to buy the boat, Poe was writing some of his most controlled, elegant prose. The purloined letter is a feat of intellectual architecture. "Thou art the man" is a puzzle box of narrative misdirection. But in the margins of these manuscripts, in the crossouts, the corrections, the ink that blots and smears, we see a different hand, a hand that trembles. The boat was not a boat. It was a symbol. It was the physical manifestation of a desire that the rational mind could not accommodate. Poe wanted to be adrift. He wanted to be the narrator of MS, found in a bottle, not the survivor, but the one who keeps writing even as the water rises. The philosophy of composition was his bottle. It was the vessel into which he poured his chaos, sealing it with the wax of logic, casting it into the world as a finished thing. But the chaos remained. It remained in the letters he wrote at 3 a.m., in the lectures he delivered where he would stop mid-sentence and stare at a corner of the room, in the years of his life that seemed, to the biographer, like a slow, deliberate unfastening. In 1846, 2 years after the boat, Virginia would hemorrhage while singing at the piano. The blood stained her white dress. Poe wrote to a friend, "I have been through a scene of the most intense agony. She lay in my arms and the blood was upon my hands. I thought of the sea. I do not know why. The sea, always the sea. The place where boundaries dissolve, where ink runs in water, where the manuscript becomes the current. Keep the candle lit. The current is stronger now." In the early 1830s, before the prize, before the fame, Poe conceived of a literary device that would have been his masterpiece of structure, had it survived. He called it the Folio Club. The idea was simple and it was mad. A group of writers, each representing a different literary style, would gather once a month in a decaying mansion. Each would read a tale. The talees would be the stories we now know, Baroness, Morla, the unparalleled adventure of One Hand's Fall, but they would be framed by a narrative that was itself a story. The members of the Folio Club were not merely readers, they were characters. And as the months passed, the reader would realize that the club itself was a kind of ship, sailing toward an unseen horizon. The final tale, the one that would have ended the collection, was to be MS, found in a bottle. But here, the structure reveals its hidden architecture. In Poe's plan, the narrator of the bottle story was not a random sailor. He was the last surviving member of the Folio Club. The ship was the club's meeting place, transformed by some alchemical shift into a vessel. and the bottle was the club's final publication, the only fragment to survive the dissolution of the society. It was a metafictional labyrinth, decades ahead of its time, and it was lost. In 1836, Poe was living in Richmond, working as the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. He had gathered the manuscripts of the Folio Club tales, intending to publish them as a single volume. The publisher, a man named Thomas W. White, had the manuscripts in his office on Main Street. On the night of December 16, 1836, a fire broke out in the building. The cause was never determined. The messenger offices were gutted, and the Folio Club manuscripts, the framing narrative, the connective tissue that would have united the tales, were destroyed. Or so the official record states. But there is a rumor that surfaces in the correspondence of Poe's acquaintances decades later. According to a letter written by Susan Archer Tawley, a Richmond poet who knew Poe in his final years, Poe told her that he had retrieved the bottle manuscript from the fire. He had gone into the burning building, she claimed, emerging with his coat smoking and a bundle of papers clutched to his chest. When asked what he had saved, he replied, "The Voyage, only the Voyage." The other tales, the ones we now consider classics, were either rewritten or lost. But the bottle manuscript, the final story, the capstone of the Folio Club, survived. If this is true, then the MS, found in a bottle we read today, is not a standalone tale. It is a fragment of a larger architecture. It is the last chapter of a novel that burned. Consider the implications. If the Folio Club was a literary society whose members were also the crew of the ghost ship, then the bottle manuscript is not a message from a stranger. It is a message from the author to himself. It is Poe's reflection on his own literary ambitions, a group of writers, each with their own voice, gathered in a space that is both a parlor and a vessel, sailing toward a conclusion that cannot be written because the writer has become part of the current. In this reading, the ship's destination, the South Pole, the whirlpool, the cataract, is not a geographical location. It is the condition of the artist at the moment of creation, the dissolution of the self into the work, the point at which the author is no longer a person standing outside the story, but a voice inside it, carried along by forces he can describe but cannot control. This is the voyage Poe never finished, not because he lacked the skill, but because to finish it would have been to admit that the voyage was his life. The fire destroyed the frame, but the bottle survived, and in the bottle the manuscript, and in the manuscript the last words of the last member of the Folio Club. We are not sailing to the pole, we are the pole, the point around which everything turns and is lost. These words are not in any published edition. They appear in a single source, the letter from Susan Archer Tawley, who claimed to have seen them in a copy Poe kept in his desk. That copy, like so much else, has vanished. Keep the candle lit. The flame is the only thing we can trust. It is winter in Fordham, 1846. The cottage on Kingsbridge Road is a small stone structure, barely more than a shelter, with a low ceiling and a hearth that cannot keep out the cold. Here, Edgar Allan Poe has brought his wife, Virginia. Hopping the country air will slow the progress of the consumption that is eating her lungs. He hopes, too, that the quiet will allow him to work. But the quiet is not quiet. It is filled with the sound of Virginia's cough, a wet, tearing sound that seems to hollow out the air. It is filled with the rustle of his own pen, scratching across paper as he writes stories of entombment, of walls, of revenge exacted in the dark. The Cask of Amontillado is written here. A man walls his enemy behind bricks, sealing him in a niche, leaving him to die in a silence that is not silence but the absence of answer. The biographers call this period Poe's triumph over adversity. They point to the stories he produced, the lectures he delivered, the growing reputation that would, too late, bring him something like security. But the letters tell a different story. The letters from Fordham are the most desperate of Poe's life. In one of these letters, written to a woman named Annie Richmond, not his wife, but a friend, a confidant, one of the lost loves who populate Poe's biography, he describes something that has no place in a rational account. In my study, he writes, there is a bottle. It is not a wine bottle, though it is shaped like one. It is made of a dark glass, nearly black, and it stands on the corner of my desk. I do not know how it came there. I do not know what it contains. But at night, when the fire has died and the room is cold, I see the liquid inside it move. It moves as though something is swimming in it, though the bottle is sealed. He does not say what the liquid is. He does not say what is swimming, but he continues. I have been tempted on several occasions to open it, to pour its contents onto the page and see what words form. But I am afraid, Annie. I am afraid that if I open it, I will not be able to close it. And the ink, for I believe it is ink, will spread until it covers the desk, the floor, the walls, until it covers me. This letter exists only in fragments. The original was destroyed by the recipient's family, who found it too disturbing to preserve. But the fragments were copied by a Poe scholar in the 1920s, and those copies survive in a university archive. We must ask, was this a metaphor? Poe was, after all, a writer of metaphors. The bottle, the ink, the spreading darkness. These are the familiar furniture of a creative mind wrestling with fear that its creations will consume it. But there is something in the tone of the letter that resists allegory. It is the tone of a man describing something he has seen with his eyes, not his imagination. Fordham was not a place of peace. It was a place of waiting. Virginia was dying, and Poe could do nothing but sit beside her, writing stories of revenge and entombment, watching the woman he loved fade into a room of white sheets and the smell of medicine. The bottle on his desk, if it existed, was not a siren. It was a companion. It was the only thing in the cottage that moved as he did not. While Virginia lay still, while the snow fell against the windows, while the fire burned down to embers, the liquid in the bottle moved, swimming, circling, waiting. Poe would later write The Sphinx, a story about a man who sees a monstrous insect through a window, only to discover it is a common moth magnified by the glass. It is a story about the terror that lives in perception, not in reality. But the terror in the Fordham letter is not about what he sees. It is about what he cannot see. The liquid moves, but the bottle is sealed. Something swims, but he cannot name it. He never opened the bottle, or if he did, he never recorded it. Virginia died on January 30, 1847. She was 24 years old. In the days after her death, Poe wrote almost nothing. He walked the frozen roads of Fordham, his coat collar turned up, his eyes fixed on the ground. When a friend came to check on him, he was found sitting at his desk, staring at the dark glass bottle, his hand inches from the cork. The friend took the bottle away. What happened to it afterward is not recorded. Keep the candle lit. The night is long and the ink is watching. In 1840, the Philadelphia publishing house of Lee and Blanchard issued Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque in 2 volumes. It was Poe's first major collection, the gathering of his early masterpieces into a form that was meant to announce his arrival as a writer of substance. The reviews were few, the sales were modest, but the books themselves, the physical objects, would become the site of a mystery that remains unsolved. 3 copies of the 1840 edition are known to exist with marginalia in Poe's hand. One is in the collection of the University of Virginia. One is in a private collection in New York. One was sold at auction in 1998 to an anonymous buyer, and its location is now unknown. The marginalia are not the critical notes one might expect from an author reviewing his own work. They are not corrections or improvements. They are coordinates. In the copy at the University of Virginia, the marginalia appear in the story MS, Found in a Bottle. Poe has drawn a small map in the margin of the page where the narrator describes the ship's course. The map is crude, a few lines, a few numbers, but it is precise. The numbers are latitude and longitude. The latitude is 82 degrees S. The longitude is 134 degrees W. These coordinates place the ship in the Southern Ocean, south of the Antarctic Circle, in a region that was uncharted in Poe's time. It is the same region described in the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, the site of the final, unreachable cataract, the white figure that stands at the edge of the world. But in the other 2 copies, the coordinates change. In the private collection in New York, the coordinates are for a point in the Atlantic, roughly 800 miles east of the coast of Florida. In the copy sold in 1998, the The coordinates are for a point in the Pacific, near the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean. Poe was not merely mapping a fictional voyage, he was mapping a progression, from the Antarctic to the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the cold to the abyss, from the known edge of the world to the place where the world drops away into nothing. Why would Poe annotate his own books with nautical coordinates? He was not a sailor, he was not a navigator, he was a writer who had tried to buy a boat and failed, who had written stories of the sea but never sailed beyond sight of land. The coordinates are not practical, they do not chart a route, they chart a destination. They are the points where the narrator of MS, found in a bottle, would have arrived if the story had continued past the whirlpool. They are the places where the manuscript becomes the sea. In one of the marginal notes, written in a hand that is noticeably shakier than the others, Poe has written a single phrase: "The ink is the current." We must pause here. The ink is the current, not a metaphor for the current. The ink is the current. The substance that flows from his pen that records the voyage is itself the force that carries the voyager. The writer is not separate from the story. The writer is inside it, written by his own ink, carried by his own words. This is the insight that Poe's contemporaries could not accept. It is the insight that the judges of the Baltimore Saturday Visitor found too unsettling for publication. The narrator of MS, found in a bottle, does not die because he cannot die. He is the ink, he is the current, he is the voyage itself, and the voyage has no end. The coordinates are the places where Poe tried to fix this truth to a map, but the map is the margin. The margin is the edge of the page, and beyond the edge is the white space, the unmarked sea, the place where the ink runs out. Keep the candle lit. The margin is wider than it seems. It is the autumn of 1849, and Edgar Allan Poe has returned to Richmond. He is 40 years old, though he looks older. His face is gaunt, his eyes hollowed by years of poverty, grief, and the alcohol that has, at various points in his life, seized him like a current he could not resist. But he is here to lecture. He is here to reclaim his place. He has a new poem, The Bells, and a new lecture, The Poetry of the Sea, and he must believe, that this time things will be different. The lecture is scheduled for the evening of October 4 at the Odd Fellows Hall. The hall is a modest venue, but it is filled. Richmond remembers Poe. They remember the boy who wandered the docks, the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger, the man who wrote The Raven and made the nation shudder. They have come to see the poet, the prodigal, the man who left and returned. Poe takes the stage. He is dressed in a black coat that is slightly too large, a white shirt that is slightly frayed. He stands at the podium, adjusts the gas lamp, and begins to speak. The text of The Poetry of the Sea is lost. No manuscript survives, but the accounts of the lecture do survive in two sources: a review in the Richmond Examiner and a letter written by a woman named Susan Tolley, who was in the audience. Both accounts agree on the central event. Poe was speaking on the poetry of the sea, tracing its presence in literature from Homer to Coleridge, building toward a conclusion that, according to Tolley, was to be about the final, fatal beauty of the voyage that does not return. He had reached the part of the lecture where he intended to read from MS, Found in a Bottle, the story that had begun his career and that he now, at its end, returned to. He opened the book. He read the first line: "Of my country and of my family I have little to say." And then he stopped. According to Tolley, Poe looked up from the page and stared at the back wall of the hall. The wall was plain plaster, white, lit by the gas lamps. There was nothing there, but Poe stared at it as though he saw something no one else could see. He stood in silence for what Tolley estimated as a full minute, though it felt longer. The audience stirred. A cough, the rustle of fabric. Still, Poe stared. Then he whispered. Tolley was close enough to hear. "She wrote," he said, "it is here." Then he shook his head as though waking from a dream and continued the lecture as if nothing had happened. The Richmond Examiner account is briefer, but it confirms the interruption. The reviewer wrote, "Mr. Poe paused for a considerable period, seemingly lost in thought. When he resumed, his voice was lower and his manner was changed. He spoke of the sea not as a subject for poetry, but as a presence. He spoke as though he were on it." What did Poe see on the white wall? Was it a trick of the light, a moment of fatigue, or was it something else, something that the rational mind cannot accommodate? Susan Tawley's account contains a detail that is often omitted. She wrote that after the lecture she approached Poe and asked him what had happened. He replied, "I saw the Voyage. It was there on the wall, the ship, the ice, the water rising. I was not speaking of it, I was in it." She asked him if he would publish the lecture so that others could read what he had intended to say. He smiled, she wrote, a smile that was not happy. "The lecture is not the Voyage," he said. "The Voyage is not a text, it is a condition, and I am in it now." These are the last recorded words of Edgar Allan Poe in Richmond. He left the city 3 days later, bound for New York. He never arrived. Instead, he was found 6 days later in Baltimore, delirious, wearing clothes that were not his own, asking for a man no one had heard of. He died on October 7, 1849, in a hospital bed. His last words a fragment that may have been a prayer, may have been a name, may have been nothing at all. But the lecture, the text of the poetry of the sea, is lost. It is the missing chapter in the manuscript of his life. We do not know what he would have said about the voyage that does not return. We only know that he paused in the middle of saying it and saw the voyage itself on a white wall, waiting for him. Keep the candle lit. The wall is closer than it seems. October 3, 1849, Baltimore, a city of red brick and narrow streets, of gaslight and fog, of taverns and polling places and the smell of the harbor. On this day, a man named Joseph W. Walker, a printer and compositor for the Baltimore Sun, was standing outside Ryan's 4th Ward polls on East Lombard Street. He saw a man slumped against a wall, disheveled, incoherent, wearing a coat that was too large for him, a hat that was not his own. Walker recognized him. He had seen him before, lecturing perhaps, or walking the streets. He approached and asked if he knew anyone in the city. The man mumbled a name, Reynolds. No one knew a Reynolds. No one came forward. Walker wrote a note to Dr. John Joseph Morin, a physician who lived nearby. The note, which survives in a facsimile, reads, "There is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's 4th Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you he is in need of immediate assistance." Poe was taken to Washington College Hospital, where he was admitted to a room with a window overlooking the city. For the next 4 days, he drifted in and out of consciousness, speaking of things that made no sense to his attending physician. He called out for a woman named Reynolds again. He spoke of a ship. He spoke of a bottle. He spoke of ink that would not dry. He died on October 7 at 5 a.m. The cause of death was listed as congestion of the brain. It was a polite term for a century that did not want to admit to alcoholism or to the truth that it did not know. Among Poe's effects, the attending physician, Dr. Morin, noted the presence of a paper parcel. It was described in Morin's later account as a small bundle, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Morin did not open it. He gave it to a colleague, Dr. John J. G. O. The initials are partially obscured in the surviving document, who was to deliver it to Poe's aunt, Maria Clem. The parcel was never delivered. It vanished. It is the most tantalizing lost object in Poe's biography. What was in it? More manuscripts, letters, the missing lecture, or the original unpublished version of MS? Found in a bottle, the one that did not end, the one that continued past the whirlpool, the one that Poe had kept for 16 years, waiting for the right moment to cast it into the world. We do not know, but we know that the parcel existed, and then it did not. It disappeared into the bureaucracy of death, into the hands of a man whose name is now lost, into the city of Baltimore, which in 1849 was a city of forgetting. There is a detail in the Baltimore story that has haunted scholars for generations. Poe was found wearing clothes that were not his own. His coat was too large. His hat was the wrong shape. The implication that he had been robbed, or that he had traded clothes with someone, or that he had been drugged and used as a Cooper, a dupe in Election Day voter fraud, has been debated endlessly. But there is another possibility, a darker possibility, one that lives in the margins of the archive. What if the man found in Baltimore was not Poe? Or rather, what if the man found in Baltimore was not the same man who left Richmond? What if, in the 6 days between Richmond and Baltimore, something happened to Poe that changed him, that replaced him with a man wearing his clothes, or wearing another's clothes, or wearing the clothes of a man who had been somewhere else? The coordinates in the margins, the lecture interrupted by a vision, the bottle in Fordham that moved on its own, the unfinished voyage. Poe wrote stories of doubles. William Wilson, the imp of the perverse, the man of the crowd, men who follow themselves, who are followed by themselves, who cannot escape the self that walks behind them. What if the man in Baltimore was the double? What if the real Poe, the one who wrote the manuscript that did not end, the one who saw the ship on the white wall, had already left, had already sailed, had already become the current? The paper parcel may have contained the answer. It may have contained the manuscript that would have told us what happened in those 6 days, but the parcel is gone, and we are left with the bottle, sealed, containing words we cannot read. Keep the candle lit. The shadow on the wall is your own. There is one story in Poe's over that stands apart. It is not his most famous. It does not contain a raven, a telltale heart, or a pit and a pendulum. It is called A Tale of the Ragged Mountains, and it was published in 1844, the same year Poe tried to buy the boat. It is the story of a man named Augustus Bedloe who, under the influence of morphine, experiences a waking dream. He walks through the ragged mountains of Virginia, sees a city that is not there, and encounters a man who will, in the dream, kill him. When Bedloe wakes, he feels a sharp pain in his temple. He touches the spot and a doctor examines it. There is a small wound, fresh, as though he had been struck, but Bedloe has not been anywhere. He has been in his chair in his room, dreaming. Later, we learn that the man Bedloe saw in the dream was a physician named Dr. Templeton, and that the city Bedloe saw was a city in India, where Templeton had once served. And we learn, in a twist that has no parallel in Poe's other work, that Bedloe has died, and that the wound on his temple matches exactly the wound that killed a man in India years before, in a scene that Templeton witnessed. It is a story of past lives, or future lives, or the simultaneity of all lives flowing together in a current that time cannot separate. Scholars have long recognized A Tale of the Ragged Mountains as Poe's most personal work, not because it is autobiographical in the literal sense. Poe did not take morphine, did not walk through the ragged mountain, did not die of a wound in India, but because it is the only story in which he directly addresses the phenomenon that shaped his life, the sense that he was living in two places at once. The story is a confession. It is Poe's attempt to explain in the language of fiction what it felt like to be him, to sit in a chair in Philadelphia, writing stories of ships and whirlpools, and to feel in his body the cold of the Antarctic, to stand on a lecture stage in Richmond and see a ship on a white wall, to lie in a hospital bed in Baltimore and speak of a voyage that had already taken him. The wound in the story is not a wound. It is the point of contact between two realities. It is the place where the dream breaks through. And Poe, Edgar Poe, carried that wound his entire life. If A Tale of the Ragged Mountains is a confession, then MS, found in a bottle, is its complement. The first is about a man who dreams a death that occurs in another time and place. The second is about a man who writes a death that is occurring as he writes it. Both are about the dissolution of the boundary between self and world, between the writer and the thing written. In The Ragged Mountains, the wound appears on Bedloe's body because the dream is not a dream. It is a crossing. In the bottle, the manuscript continues past the point of physical extinction because the narrator has become the medium of his own telling. He is not a man writing a story. He is a story writing a man. This is the insight that Poe could not publish. This is the voyage that could not be completed because completion would require the cessation of the self. The manuscript does not end because the narrator does not die. He keeps writing, and in the keeping, he becomes the ink, the current, the bottle that contains the message that cannot be read because the reader is inside it. Poe died in Baltimore, or he did not. The record is ambiguous, and ambiguity is the only truth we can trust. But his stories survive, and in them he survives. The narrator of MS, found in a bottle, is still writing. He is writing now in the margins of this script, in the ink of your attention, in the current that carries you from word to word. Keep the candle lit. The wound is not where you think it is. We return to the library that does not exist. The Astor Library on Lafayette Street, dissolved into the city's marrow but preserved here in the space between memory and story. The vitrine is still there. The velvet is still the color of dried blood. And the manuscript is still resting on, the ink sloping violently across the page, the title scratched out and written again. MS, found in a bottle. But this is not the manuscript we think it is. This is not the published tale, the polished version, the one that won the prize and launched a career. This is the other one, the one that does not conclude, the one that keeps writing. Look closely. The ink is not dry. It gleams in the candlelight, wet, moving as though it has just been applied. The last sentence is incomplete. It trails off into a line that curves like a wave into the margin. And the margin is not white. It is the color of water at dusk, dark and deep, and it extends beyond the edge of the page, beyond the edge of the vitrine, beyond the edge of the library that does not exist. We have followed the trail of ink from Baltimore to Richmond, from Richmond to Philadelphia, from Philadelphia to Fordham, and back to Baltimore. We have traced the coordinates in the margins, the lost manuscripts, the fire, the boat that was never bought, the lecture that was never finished, the bottle that moved on its own. And we have arrived here at the place where the voyage does not end. The truth, if we can speak of truth in matters of mystery and folklore, is that Poe did not write MS, found in a bottle. He lived it. He lived it from the moment he heard the story of the Aurora on the Richmond docks, to the moment he tried to buy a boat to sail into the Atlantic, to the moment he stood on a stage and saw the ship on the white wall. He lived it and he wrote it, and the writing became the living. The manuscript in the bottle is not a document. It is a process. It is the process of dissolution, of becoming the current, of being carried to a place where the self is no longer separate from the story. Poe did not finish the voyage because the voyage is not a thing to be finished. It is a condition to be entered. And we, the readers, the listeners, the ones who keep the candle lit in the darkness of the archive, we have entered it. We have followed the ink from the page to the margin, from the margin to the water, from the water to the current. We are not reading the story. We are in it. Let us extinguish the candle now, not because the story is over, but because the candle is no longer needed. The light that remains is not the light of flame. It is the light of the white page, the unmarked sea, the place where the ink runs out and something else begins. The last words of the manuscript, the one that does not conclude, are not words. They are a gesture, a line that curves into the margin like a wave, like a breath, like a hand reaching toward the surface of the water. And on the surface, a bottle, and in the bottle, a message. And in the message, the only truth that matters. Keep the candle lit, or let it go. The voyage does not distinguish. This is the legacy of Edgar Allan Poe. Not the raven, not the telltale heart, not the pit and the pendulum. Those are the stories we read in school, the ones we memorized, the ones that have become safe. The true legacy is the voyage that does not end, the manuscript that keeps writing, the ink that is the current, carrying us to a place where the self dissolves in something else, something older, something deep, something that was there before we were, takes its place. We close the vitrine. We walk out of the library that does not exist. We step into the street, into the city, into the world of clocks and appointments and the solid ground that seems so solid. But we carry something with us, a whisper, a trace, a line of ink that curves into the margin of our own lives. The manuscript found in a bottle, not found, not finished, not lost. It is here. It has always been here. It is the story we are writing now, with every word, with every breath, with every moment we spend in the candlelight of the archive, listening for the sound of a voice that is not our own. The voyage continues.